yeah, today we'll be going over, the whole brainstem area, right? Underneath the thalamus. We talked about the thalamus and the cerebrum.
Hello?
You're not sharing your screen.
We talked about the other parts of the brain, right? We started out kind of with the thalamus and how it projected out into the cerebrum for that higher order brain activity, right? Consciousness, voluntarily control over stuff. And then today we're going to do kind of like the lower brain areas, right? Stuff that a lizard could do or something like that, right? So this is what we're going to go over, a little bit of the details today, and really go into detail about a couple of particular functions about them, right? So just to review though, always keep everything in context. We're talking about the nervous system. We've been talking about the nervous system the whole time, and we started out talking about neural communication, right? Input, whether it was from other neurons like we see here, right? It was spilling neurotransmitter on, you had a local depolarization event. If you had enough stimuli, you would reach the axon hillock, open up those voltage gated channels and send an action potential down there so you could pass the signal on, right? Or this could be sensory neurons, right? Sensory, some kind of receptor stimulating the neuron, and you'd have the same thing, right? But it's always about this neural communication. This is the nervous tissue. That's what is going on when we're talking about, this controlling this getting information from that. Keep kind of everything in mind as we talk about this. So, the nervous tissue itself, the stuff that's doing the communicating, could be, what we have talked about in terms of, say, simple reflexes, right? A stress receptor, maybe in the muscle, right? Stimulating these guys, action potential goes down, goes into the central nervous system, does something or other in the spinal cord, and then goes out here and connects to a muscle, right? And that's like the somatic, that's a very simple reflex. There was also stuff like maybe, it doesn't have to be something that what's happening, right? It could be something like a stretch receptor in your blood vessel, right? You would never know about this, right? But it would activate sensory neurons in there, and it would send an axon into here. And then what would it do? It would do something really complicated inside the central nervous system. And eventually you'd go down there and maybe counteract this, maybe relax the blood vessel, maybe constrict it, do something like that. In that case, it would be like smooth muscle might be your target. Or this could be something like maybe a smell, right? An odor, and you're hungry. It could be, baked bread or something, odorant molecule, a good one. And it would stimulate your receptors, and you'd send an action potential in here. You do all sorts of complicated stuff in your brain, and then you'd be like getting hungry and stuff. And eventually you'd like, maybe this is one of those motor neurons that stimulate a salivary gland, and you start salivating. Right, so that is going to, all these are going to, have the same sort of action, right? But inside here is where it gets really complicated. Like these parts are pretty simple. Inside here is where it gets really complicated. And we saw a little bit about that with all those sensory cortices, right? The occipital, the auditory, the parietal one, right? We couldn't even talk about what the complexity of what was going on there while you're building a picture of the outside world with this sensory input. So, but always, again, keep all this in mind about what is going on here, because that part over here where I talked about, a stretch receptor in your blood vessel or any kind of internal thing going inside your brain, and something's going wrong out here that your sensory neurons are detecting too low oxygen, too high CO2, blood pressure too high, something like that. It's going to send it up, and where it's going to go is not anywhere to your conscious brain, but your brainstem inside the central nervous system. And then it's going to act to sort of counteract whatever's happening here to maintain homeostasis. Right, so that gets us into our whole brainstem, right? And all those kind of activities, these vital life functions that your brainstem might be covering out. You know, if you looked at a brainstem of this stage right over here, if you look at the relative size of expansion for their cerebral cortex, it goes crazy, right? From here to here. But if you look at the relative size of the brainstem, right, your midbrain, your pons, your medulla, right, it doesn't really change that much, right? This is what makes us kind of human, right? Because all the human function or high level stuff. This stuff, if you look at it, it looks the same as it does almost in a fish as it does in us. Not quite, but it's very similar, right? And especially like higher primates and even any kind of mammal. You look at this between a human and that, it's almost the same. And in fact, this is the region where if you get the zombie virus, right, this is the part that gets activated. And then you walk around, even though you're dead out here in this brain, and you're just driven to go eat whatever, if it's another person or whatever, right? It's just a fact. And that's where it's happening in this part of your brain, your zombie part of your brain, your lizard part of your brain. But it's important stuff. So all this stuff, right, is happening. Your midbrain, you can't really quite see. It's a little bit behind there. And then you're going to have your pons and your medulla, right? That's going to be your brainstem, right? Which is going to be continuous with the spinal cord. So we're going to look at think about the organization of the spinal cord, recap that a little bit, compare this, what's going on here. Because basically your brainstem is kind of like a combination of a spinal cord and your cerebrum right there, doing a little bit of each right there. More complicated than the spinal cord, not so complicated as your cerebrum. But again, for the cadaver picture, cerebrum, diencephalon, cerebellum, your brainstem is this kind of lower end as your spinal cord enters your foramen magnum into your skull right there. It becomes your brainstem, right? Your medulla, your pons, and your midbrain. So midbrain, pons, medulla, right? And we're going to look at the features, a couple of the features and the functions of each of these regions right here. So back just real quick to the spinal cord, thinking about what the spinal cord, like what kind of control the spinal cord had over the body, right? What kind of central nervous system function we were talking about when we talked about spinal cord stuff. So the spinal cord, right, you have these segments, these certain spinal segments, and they're basically, each little segment like C7, C8, all these ones, they kind of spread out right around like lateral to where they were and innervate that region, right? In this region, you got your limbs and stuff. So there was a whole bunch of them coming out, like in your trunk, your T4, T6, they're basically covering this area of the body right there. And the integration that they were doing was also pretty local, right? Stuff you were doing, if you had some kind of stimuli in your foot that required a reflex action, it would go into a very local segment of your spinal cord down here that took information from that foot and had the motor neurons that were controlling the muscles there around the leg right there. So it was a very local kind of reflex, just covering, the segment of the body that it was covering, right? So this is your spinal cord. And you had those nuclei, right, that were covering that area of the body, sensory nuclei, getting information from that area of the body, and motor nuclei kind of controlling that area of your body more or less. And that's pretty much all it was doing, these really simple reflexes. Also, on the outside of the spinal cord, you had white matter tracks, right? Going up, ascending toward the brain, and then down, descending from the brain along on the outside white matter right here. It was very kind of a simple organization right here. And for those reflexes, right, you had, again, very kind of simple, like sensory neurons picking up information in a certain segment, going in and then kind of doing whatever little integration you might do, and then sending it out for that very kind of simple, easy reflex that you don't need a brain for, right? Very local. It didn't really affect the rest of the body necessary. And this is a somatic one, like something you could feel, and because there's going to be connections to your conscious brain, but there's also very simple segmental reflexes for those motor neurons that are controlling like your visceral stuff, right? So this is the defecation reflex. You have stretch receptors embedded within the walls of your GI tract, such that when they stretch due to movement of feces coming down here, right, you got the information going in, talking to motor neurons in there, that would cause, whatever kind of relaxing of that, right? So it was very local control. It wasn't really affecting anywhere else in the body. It was just that local little piece of this digestive tract or this or that muscle, right? This is your spinal cord. So stimulus, sensory information coming in, and then controlling it right there at the spinal cord level. But also, this may branch off and then go up to the brain. And then the brain is going to also, incorporate this information into whatever your overall level of activity is, right? It's going to be aware of it maybe, or maybe not, right? So here's another simple reflex. This is your bladder, the micturition, very simple reflexes, where when your bladder expands, because you have to pee, right? You have stretch receptors in the wall of your bladder. When those become activated, they send the nerve impulse into the spinal cord. And what that does is send a motor neuron over here, a visceral motor neuron, which basically is going to relax these sphincters here. And then, it's going to loosen up the internal sphincter at least. That's going to allow the bladder to void, right? We also have an external one so we don't just void anytime, right? But that's a very simple reflex. But we know, as I said, we don't just always void every time we have to pee, right? There's also information coming from upper areas of your brain, in particular your brainstem, that do automatic control over when and where we can release, even without thinking about it, right? When you're sleeping at night or stuff like that, right? You have automatic control over when you decide to urinate, right? So this is coming from these higher order parts of the brain, right? Rather than just a spinal reflex, much more complex and really integrated with a whole bunch of other stuff that's going on in your brain and body right there. Not just these very easy spinal reflexes, right? So a lot of these reflexes, some of them might be in the hypothalamus, which we'll talk about, but a lot of them in interface with the hypothalamus are right here in the brainstem right here. Right? So that would be the urinary bladder control. You'd also have things like blood pressure control and respiratory centers, which we'll get into a little bit detail today. Right, but these are all doing very, very complex reflexes, but ultimately it'll be stimulus, sensory input, integration, response, right, as a motor output, right, in some very complicated way. And that a lot of that, this unconscious stuff, is going to be happening in our brainstem here. So integration, right? Integration either in your brain, right, or your brainstem of sensory input, whether that sensory input is stuff we're conscious of or stuff, like blood pressure that we're not conscious of. And then there's going to be integration again in the cerebrum, maybe because we can analyze what this is, incorporate it into our particular state of thirst or knowledge about this glass of water, all that complicated stuff. And then the complicated motor movements it goes to carry out that, right? So this is what's happening in the somatic sort of version of these arcs right here: cerebrum, somatic, conscious, voluntary, right? You can choose to pick up that glass of water or not, even if you're really thirsty. So that's what you want to associate with this pathway. Whereas this pathway, it's going to be the hypothalamus and brainstem are going to be kind of controlling this, and the input will be kind of unconscious, right? When your blood pressure is too high, you don't actually particularly know about it. but there's sensors in there that are going to pick that up. You don't know when your oxygen levels are necessarily too low. You might get secondary signs because you start getting dizzy, but there's nothing that tells you like, attack in your finger or something, or, a burning sensation on your skin. There's nothing like that. It's all unconscious. And then the response will also be unconscious. It doesn't involve this part of your brain. It could happen when you're totally asleep, when you're unconscious, even when you're in a coma sometimes. So this is the sort of things we're going to, kind of looking at today, and functions of the brainstem, versus what we talked about last time. But again, keep it all in this kind of, think about, just keep mind in this, right? Homeostasis and control over this kind of behavior. So within your body, right? And this is just an example, oxygen sensors in your blood vessels. You have some kind of sensors in there when there is low pressure oxygen, basically in some way. This is going to cause these calcium channels to open, right? And for whatever reason, or close rather, sorry. And when they close, right, your cell depolarizes because the potassium doesn't flow out. When that happens, when you get this depolarization, just like any other depolarization, in this case, causes the voltage-gated calcium channels to open, cause a release of neurotransmitter onto your sensory neuron that's covering that area. From there, that's going to send that information. In this case, it's saying to the medullary centers, that is your medulla oblongata in your brainstem. And what that's going to do, the effect of that is going to be to increase your breathing rate, your ventilation. Okay, so that's a kind of an example of how your body's picking up this kind of unconscious information by oxygen centers, for instance, in your blood vessels. So just to sort of, add a little complexity to that. And again, this is just more for your own knowledge, so you don't think it's like totally lizard-like. All that stuff is happening, like the urinary reflex, right? You have to pee or something, your bladder's full, and so you get that urge to pee, right? But you could hold it back through conscious control, right? But that there's a psychological element to this all, right? It's like when you're an hour away from going to the bathroom, you can kind of hold it in, but the closer you get to it, right, that psychological stress, it starts to make that urge feel much stronger, right? So all that's happening somewhere in your emotional brain, or a lot of stress makes you want to pee or something like that. So it's much more complex than even in the brainstem, right? But I just want to add that little layer of complexity to some of these very basic sort of reflexes that usually we may not be aware of, right? All right. So for our brainstem, right, it's going to have some local control, like your spinal cord segments, through cranial nerve centers, which also are going to have complex control, but also other complex centers controlling these systems all over your body, right? Your heart rate, your respiratory center, right? So in some ways, it's a combination of our brain and our spinal cord. In other words, we got nuclei like cranial nerve nuclei, like we have spinal nerve nuclei. But then we also have these nuclei that are, regulating passage from your cerebrum to your cerebellum, or lower parts of your spinal cord. We'll have all the tracks going up and down your spinal cord, just up and down your brain to your spinal cord and to your cerebellum. And then we'll all have those higher order brain centers, like the respiratory ones, like we'll talk about, as well as ones that modulate your overall brain activity. Right, so this is your brainstem kind of generic sort of picture.